Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Broken Rails 1201st New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Ohan Breiding and Jill H. Casid. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Ohan Breiding is a visual artist, filmmaker raised in a Swiss village and currently living between Brooklyn, New York, and Williamstown, Massachusetts. Through drawing, photography, photographic and filmic archives, video, and collaboration, they employ a trans-feminist lens to the discussion of ecological care by amplifying landscapes as witness. They have presented their work at galleries, museums, and film festivals nationally and internationally. Breiding is an assistant professor in the art department at Williams College. And our host today, an artist, theorist, and historian, Jill H. Casid, holds the appointment of Professor of Visual Studies in the Department of Art History and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Casid is bringing to completion Doing Things with Being Undone in the Necrocene, the first part of two-book project on form at the edges of life. Casid is the author of Sewing Empire, Landscape and Colonization, Scenes of Projection, Recasting the Enlightenment Subject, and the co-edited collection Art History in the Wake of the Global Turn. Casid's artwork has been exhibited nationally and internationally. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jill, to get us started.
Oh, thank you, Min. And wow, I'm so excited to share space with such a wonderful assembly of friends, intimates, comrades, fellow travelers. I'd like to start us off with a personal acknowledgement. I'm the queer descendant of Jewish refugees from Germany and what's now Belarus and Ukraine. My great-grandmother, after whom I was named, was taken on the first transport of Jews out of the Baden region to the Gorsk concentration camp in southern France. As the descendant of dispossessed Jews, many of whom did not survive, I refuse the instrumentalized theft of my grief and losses and the tactical weaponization of Holocaust memory more generally as fuel for the Israeli state's genocidal and voracious war machine. I condemn the US bankrolling of this extermination, the assaults on artistic, academic, and journalistic freedom, and the double standards with regard to boycotts and calls for divestment and sanctions. In the names of my ancestors and my own, I'm with Palestine still, in not just calling for ceasefire, but also naming to dismantle the genocidal apartheid regime of our time, and doing so as a praxis of love. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation. I also recognize that I join you via Zoom. I want to thank my friend Ximing Yang for the acknowledgement that Zoom is not outside settler colonial occupation. The Zoom corporate technology that brings us together virtually is headquartered in San Jose, California, on unceded Muwekma Ohlone land. Let's remember that virtual space too has a material basis and participates in the ongoing legacies of land theft. Without material consideration of land back, the right of return, reparations, and abolition of the carceral state and colonial occupation, acknowledgement is never enough. Let's then not just acknowledge, but also open the possible portal that holding this conversation presents as a chance to send the reverberations of a never again for anyone and a transversal no to US imperial funding of the Israeli state war machine, no to the carceral state, no to selective solidarity, no to white supremacy and Euro exceptionalism, and no to the defunding of structures of care and support. And doing so is the channel for a binding bond among the uncounted in the condition of a worldlessness that in my own work I've been calling the necrocene, to bring close a reckoning with the catastrophe that occurs and has already occurred, and yet within this worldlessness, a palpable sense that there are still ways of doing things with being undone, to insist on the supports for livable life for Palestinian, Black, Brown, Indigenous, migrant, refugee, crip, queer, and trans life. Let's go ahead and at this point share slides, starting with a view of the installation at Mass MoCA. It's an honor to be in conversation and to have this chance to continue and share out the inspiring conversation that artistic force Ohan Breiding and I began under the auspices of Triangle Arts when Ohan was completing what became truly their tour de force film, Belly of the Glacier. Their queer, trans, eco-feminist, ecstatic, and extimate ecological elegy, what one um, of their stills calls their winter garden, to an end of the world that's also a beginning, or at least an opening, that meditatively, kaleidoscopically, at once intimately, yet also even tearing with aspects of the sublime, across archives at once scientific and even familial, in the necessarily expanded transhuman sense, if families also include the calf that we see being born and the calving glacier we witness wrapped in thermal blankets and dripping as it melts. I've been thinking long about ways of doing things with being undone in the Necrocene, ways of not just facing extinction, but also using the ends of the world as a medium to transform as we contest the throwaway terms of our dying. And when Ohan told me about their plans for filming a speculative version of the political funeral and a political funeral to the glacier as the culmination of Belly of the Glacier, they had me at speculative, but certainly at funeral. We'll be punctuating our conversation with 3 short clips from Belly of a Glacier that forms the centerpiece of the exhibition at Massimoka that we're seeing in the slideshow here. And I want to call out that that's a show that can be seen until December of this year, 2025. And before we close by listening together to Glacier Elegy, composed and performed by Dorian Wood with lyrics by Ohan, we'll also talk about Ohan's solo show at AIR Gallery Beside the Sun that if you're in New York, you can see until April 20. And while the installation slides are pretty wonderful, it's work that really calls to be witnessed in person. So we're going to start with a short clip from the beginning of Belly of the Glacier. And let's go ahead and share that, Min.
I'm going to reload really quickly.
Es ist Dezember. Ich gang raus in den Schnee. Mit jedem Schritt sinke ich ein bisschen ein. Mein Körper drückt den Boden unter meinen Füßen weg. Alles ist glatt und bläulich-weiß. Grosse Schneeflocken fallen vom Himmel ab. Eine landet auf meiner Handfläche. Sie ist perfekt und symmetrisch, mit 6 Punkten, die von der Mitte wie eine Blume rausgehen. Sie ist so schön, dass ich sie meiner Mutter schenken möchte. Als ich auf sie zugehe, beobachte ich, wie ihre Form sich verändert. Bis die Hitze von meinem Körper sie verschwinden lässt.
Ohan, and thinking with your title, Belly of a Glacier, I learned that in what's called glacier anatomy, glaciers produce ice tongues that project outward or extend extremities toward dissolution and death. And could we, Min, go to number 17? As in your photograph, glacier tongue, parentheses, shroud, while glaciers hold bellies at their central core, the interior pocket, or as you put it in the photograph, belly of a glacier portal. And that's number 15, Min. A portal where the glacier actively builds itself. I already knew that calving is when parts of a glacier break off, and that this process of cleaving, where ice meets water, is increasing with climate catastrophe. In bringing us close to where the water we also are meets and is dependent on both glacier and calf in transition, you also take us into the living and dying archive of ice, but also its poetry, its capacity to bear eloquent witness. I wonder if we might begin with how you weave the personal. You even call a still from the film, and could we look at 16? Your winter garden image, which in referencing theorist, semiotician Roland Barthes' book, Camera Lucida, reminds me of his audacious move in which, well before auto theory, he announces in Camera Lucida, I take my body as the measure of photography, or in other words, uses an enfleshed eye to retell the history of photography in a way that puts us in contact with the piercing punctum of the experience of the that has been. I wonder if we might talk about the way that you use an enfleshed and particular eye and various tools to not so much take the measure, but rather quicken our pulse to what we can do at the end of the glacier and end of the world.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Jill. It's really an honor to be here with you and to continue our conversation. Also, thank you to Chloe and Magli and Min and everyone from the Brooklyn Rail for your support and for hosting us today. I would also like to say I'm very excited to see some of my both past and current students on this Zoom audience, which is always a great pleasure. Jill, I love the way you articulate my enfleshed eye in relation to Roland Barthes. I take my body as the measure of photography. That's still something that really sticks with me in my own work and also in the way that I teach photography today. There are a few things I would like to discuss in relation to this. I would say the first is the photograph, which you're all seeing, which I call my winter garden. And maybe for those present here today that are not familiar with Roland Barthes' work, he describes his own winter graph photograph as the so-called image of his recently deceased mother in considerable detail in his book, Camera Lucida. He says the photograph was very old. The corners were blunted from having been pasted into an album. The sepia print had faded, and the picture just managed to show two children standing together at the end of a little wooden bridge in a glassed-in conservatory that was called a winter garden in those days. That's how he describes it. And then, despite proposing that, something like an essence of the photograph floated in this particular picture, he refuses to reproduce it, claiming that for us, it would be nothing but an indifferent picture. So, in a way, he invites us to project our own image of a lost loved one into that void. And that became a really important starting point for this project, Belly of a Glacier. This is exactly what I did, but I almost did it in a reversed way of how Roland thought to have done it, where instead of showing the viewer or not showing the viewer an image of my mother, I re-photographed and filmed a photograph that my mother took of me. I'm on the sled in this photograph, and my father in the late 80s on the Rhone Glacier. And then by creating a time-based work where each time it is screened, so currently at Mass MoCA, it begins with my mother's gaze. I'm extending her life, or at least a projection of it. I'm also protecting the sometimes innocence of my childhood glacier and a once healthy one. Glacier landscapes, while also, alluding to my own body's implications in the melting of the glacier, by having my best friend's daughter's voice retell one of my first childhood memories of catching a snowflake, seeing how beautiful it was, wanting to gift that to my mother, and by the time I've reached her, my own body heat has melted that snowflake. And so maybe another way to think through this question, Jill, is also in the very beginning of this project, I measured all the scars on my own body, scars mostly from injuries from, like I used to play professional hockey, and I say till this day, my love for ice and strong women continues. So scars from hockey, from surfing, top surgery scars. And when I measured all these scars, they made up exactly 1 meter in length, and that happens to be the exact dimension of ice cores that are cut from their original place in the glacier after being extracted and then shipped and stored in the ancient ice archive. Almost in a way thinking of a Lacanian mirroring happening in the very beginning of this project between my trans body and the ice body. Or my mother's body and my body. And I never really considered myself an environmental artist. And although I'm so deeply indebted to nature, the wilderness, the plant and animal world, I realized at some point that in the end, everything comes down to our planet, climate change, and ultimately extinction. So for me to understand the death of a glacier, the death of all glaciers in the next 50 years, I needed to start with a grief familiar to me, with the death of my mother, that which to some extent will always be the punctum of my work, to bring it back to Barthes. And maybe lastly, I would like to add that it is important for me to think through and reflect on the violences from which the history of photography stem, and the archive has always been a place from which queer, trans, and POC people have been excluded. So starting from a personal place, from this fleshy place of the eye, and from my family photo archive allows me to act from a place of care and embodied knowledge as an antidote to violence.
Oh, I didn't know about the measuring of your scars. That's exquisite. Thank you for sharing that. It was more a sense of intuition that so thank you. With that in mind, let's Min, please show the clip from the middle of Belly of a Glacier. And in moving to show a clip from the middle of the film, I'd like us to consider the analogy you build between care for the glacier and the caretakers of the ice archive, that I wonder if we might consider extending to the care you take as a photographer, filmmaker, and installation artist to curate a particular experience for us. So with that, let's go ahead and show the clip.
Geschichten zur Zeit erzählen Geschichten über unsere vergangene Welt und was wir ihr angetan haben. Und auch, was für eine Zukunft wir hinterlassen werden. Umweltverschmutzung, Hunger, Krankheit, Krieg. Alles ist im gefrorenen Wasser versiegelt. Mit erhitztem Metall, das über Jahrhunderte hinweg schneidet, bohren sie Löcher tief ins uralte Eis. Sobald es im Gefrierer ist, wird es ordentlich gestapelt. Der jüngste hoch oben und der älteste tief unten. So werden Geheimnisse vor Jahrhunderten bewahrt.
So were we to be watching this together in the space of the gallery, Ohan, you'd have us sitting on shipping containers used to pack ice core samples in the cold and watching in a gallery deliberately set to a lower temperature. In her essay for your book, and I've got a copy of that wonderful book here, Alina Williams talks about your project shifting the regime of hydrological experimentation from the regime of science to an exploratory space of interpretation. And perhaps we might also say an affective space in which we may be moved by the encounter with the no longer just abstractions or extractions of the prismatic slivers of ice seen under a petrographic microscope that press us tight to the material residue of events such as the ash from the eruption of Mount Okmok in the Umnak Islands in Alaska's Aleutian Island that bring up the hypothesized connection between volcanic eruption and the fall of the Roman Empire. Would you speak to your practice of care or the ethos at work in the aesthetic moves you're making in preparing our encounter with the otherwise abstractions of your work with scientific imaging? The research you transmediate by taking us into the West Antarctic ice sheet drilling site in Antarctica and the National Science Foundation Ice Core facility in Colorado. And
Yeah.
maybe, Min, we could perhaps move to some of the installation shots that show the ice slivers might be helpful here.
Yeah, thank you
Sorry,
for
Ohan.
no, that's all good. Thank you for that. Maybe also to give some context, because I always realize the sound, like the sound component is equally important to me as the visuals. And when you're entering in, like following this ancient ice curator into its largest ancient ice facility, the sounds you're hearing is a recording from, again, my best friend from childhood, her daughter, and then her mother. So it's three generation of women speaking throughout this ancient ice archive. So really also thinking about the role of gender within these scientific spaces. And yeah, I think when I first started this project, I started looking at representations of glaciers, mostly from our historical contexts. And my mind would always go to Caspar David Friedrich, one of the Romantic painters that also growing up in Switzerland was someone that I studied a lot, and in particular his majestic Sea of Ice oil painting created in 1823. Many of the other paintings were done with watercolor prior to this depiction. I also really like thinking of this 1823 painting because it's right around the time that photography is being invented. So thinking of the first representations of glaciers that are stemming actually more from our imagination or from storytelling rather than having accurate depictions. And in Sea of Ice, for those of you who don't know, it's a monumental pyramid in the foreground made of sheets of ice that seem to have been moving, pressing into one another. This in itself is an impressive sight. After a few seconds, the viewer might discover the wreck, like a shipwreck, on the right-hand side, caught in the ice. This presence of a man-made item gives us a sense of the scale of this landscape, the size of the ice sheets, but also of the sheer power of nature, able to crush a large boat as if it were made of card. And of course, many other of his paintings are other paintings done during this time period that think about landscapes in relation to the sublime, that are always, white men making them and or are in the frame, and also thinking about the distance that's between the subject, either the painter or the subject in the painting or both, and the landscape. And to me, I was thinking I would like to really queer this notion, and create a document of a dying glacier that begins from a place that is really up close and personal, beside my formative childhood years and the representation of these years via snapshots, as that first image we were looking at, my winter garden, archived in my family albums and very early video. I spent much time during the last 3 years photographing and filming the glacier in an intimate way. In my photographs, for example, I document the glacier mostly through vertical images, as if taking portraits of friends or loved ones, and try to refuse documenting the glacier horizontally for the most part. Of course, there's times where I am once or twice replicating this image of the sublime to just show you how big this landscape is. And then also, unlike painting, allows me to maybe, or not unlike painting, I should say, allows me to slow down. So to think about the photographic or filmic process in a way that is meditative and using the camera as a tool for maybe mediation for care, and not as an extractive tool as we know it. So I think this form of relationship to almost like touching, to really slowly looking at a certain space of the glacier and then returning to that same place and recognizing how its body has changed, and maybe even thinking about that relationship to my own body, to, a aging body or a sickly body or disabled body or body in transition, and or in flux. And I also created this ritual on the glacier where I took my clothes off and laid down onto the ice in different positions over a period of time, allowing the glacier to create imprints of itself on my body. So it felt like really like this is an act of performance that was not for the cameras, not in the film, but a way to really feel that glacier and have it, yeah, create these imprints, that were very visible and then, of course, disappeared after a while. And maybe similar to pushing my body to its limits to create this work by both, needing to hike to extremely high altitudes, where it's harder to breathe, carrying a lot of gear, always having to think about the weather, or the harshness of the cold, to, witnessing a cow birth, which for me was extremely beautiful and also very difficult experience, or just otherworldly experience. I think there's something about this state of mind or connection maybe to spirituality that occurs when I'm pushing myself in these forms, that allows for a sense of intimacy, in relationship to both me and the camera and what the camera is seeing or recording, uh, hopefully as a way to dismantle these very violent notions of what we know the history of photography to be.
That's so beautiful, thinking about to the relationship of the photographs to uh, ephemeral imprinting of ice on your body that kind of affectively hovers around, but we don't see. That's a perhaps perfect transition to a set of photographs that I'd love us to focus on. Min, could you take us to 11? Yeah, I'd really love us to speak to the interplay between film and still photographs in the exhibition, and particularly what your ghostscapes do. As your titles, Ghostscape, after Obregon's residents insulate the Rhone Glacier to slow its rapid melting, reminds us these are images with the traces of caretaking. But it's no simple after, in that you put us into a time space in which we're visited by, as the wonderful title of your show at Oki offers, with its hailing of us with the phrase future ghost, the presence of the death and the loss that will have been, which you orchestrate to haunt us intimately and actively in advance. Would you speak to this work with the ghost? It seems a particular way to address the Anthropocene as a different kind of scene in which ghosts are already here for us to make a relation with. Perhaps we might also address this relation making with the ghost in relation to your large scale photographic installation, and that's number 19. In which the ghost presence is an active wound site that, rather than your photography bringing to light or illuminating, it's the haunting presence of the active wound site that's the source of light, or as you put it, to dress a wound from what shines from it. can we unpack this different mode of address and the way it enwraps photography in our looking into a relation of dressing a wound that works with rather than turns from or covers over what emanates from it?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, I love that you're asking me to talk about ghosts. No one's ever asked me that. And then,
Really?
yeah, so that, yeah, maybe people are scared to ask that question, but I guess I'm interested in ghosts as these like in-betweeners, which I consider myself to be as well as, souls and spirits, neither dead or alive, similar to glaciers, actually. I think um, that ghosts in relation to my work are almost like a methodology that allows for pieces to come undone or remain unfinished, find new ways to exist, to repeat, or even to weave between the still photographic image and the moving picture. I had done another iteration of this installation for a museum in France, and the starting point to that was my winter garden. So it started with my winter garden, then it was 111 Giclée prints for that, and then that became the beginning to my film, and then now it's removed from this. So just to give you a sense of how this weaving in and out between the still and the moving image work. And then, both ghost and specter share the Latin origin spectrum, meaning appearance, vision, or apparition, quite similar to the formal aspects of how, let's say, an analog photograph appears in the dark room or on my Instagram story, today, or even thinking of a projection of light that was used to create the first form of photography in camera obscuras or the newest video installations. And I know, Jill, in your work, you so elegantly write about projections also. So I've been thinking about that a lot as well, in the relationship to the erotics, which, we can get to afterwards. But I would say that these mediums are deeply rooted in science and technology, yet ghosts exist outside of the sciences. They're pseudo. And yet haunting is a word that I find that we're using so commonly now to describe our current state of the climate emergency coinciding with technological progress. So the title of that installation that you were showing, that to dress a wound from what shines from it, is the second version, and it's actually from a quote by Anne Carson that's in her book The Beauty of the Husband, where she writes, quote, "A wound gives off its own light, surgeons say. If all the lamps in the house were turned out, you could dress this wound by what shines from it," end quote. And what I like about this quote is that it speaks to darkness and to the ways that we need the absence of light to see or feel the wounds we share perhaps have inflicted. And on an organic level, I like thinking about the insides of our bodies having, very similar shapes in our organs and colors, and that a wound is something that connects the inside of our body to the outside world. Um, and then living in a societal fugue state, which I think in your land acknowledgement and the way that you introduced this whole talk, Jill, I agree with so many things you're saying. And I think we need to acknowledge that for me, when I returned to my childhood home in rural Switzerland and the now what I call ghostscape of the Rhone Glacier, where neighboring villagers from Obergoms drape these thermal blankets over the glacier to insulate it from rising temperatures, I was really interested in this ad hoc, like collective ways of caretaking that was happening in this village close to my upbringing, and also thinking about the types of people that they're just people that all happen to live in the same neighborhood. And that's why they're doing that, because they care for a landscape, because they live in the same proximity, but not necessarily because they, have similar, come from like similar backgrounds or jobs, or whatever. And these villagers are trying to keep the glacier at a steady temperature to connect it, to take it away basically from the sun or from the lightness, as this quote says, and create a dark space that is ultimately a healing space, similar to the curators in the ancient ice archive, whose job it is to keep the ice cores at a very steady temperature so that researchers or artists like myself, can step into this archive and study the past by looking at these ice cores in order to perhaps predict the future of climate change, future plagues, wars, and ultimately extinction. And for my show at Ochi Gallery, I was really thinking about this, the German etymology of the word home, which means Heimat in German, either home or haunting. And so, what does it mean to return home to a place that's both safe or, in ways, reminds me of this beautiful time with my brothers and my mother still being alive, to also thinking of this space that's now become haunting or a ghost. And the word for guest or Gast in German also means ghost. So while examining my own roots as a visitor to the remains of the glacier, I myself become a visitor since this landscape has shifted so much, as have I. And according to glaciologists, or I also love, they're called cryologists, like people who study the ice, are now predicting that this particular glacier will have fully melted by the year 2050. And I think it's really important to note that the Rhone Glacier becomes the Rhone River, which is the artery that connects the Swiss Alps to northern Africa and the Middle East via the Mediterranean. So I'm also thinking about the fugue state of what this body of ice now recalls in terms of other forms of photography we're seeing circulating, and thinking of fugue state that has the word refugee, or fugue as in to flow or to flee. Rhone from Latin means to flow. And instead of thinking about death as something singular, but maybe about it as a space for transition, and on a molecular level, this ice already existing in multiple places simultaneously, so that how ice is trans-temporal. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, I didn't used to make big works. I always said I want all my works to fit in a backpack, and this is quite monumental, but for me, it felt very important to think about a monument, which, a glacier is a monument, but the way I think we're so used to experiencing a monument is through something that happens very fast. And for me, it felt important to think about ways that I could use the photographic medium to slow down time and create a space of wonder or contemplation, and thinking about our own implications in what's happening in terms of the climate at large. For me, that happens to start with the Rhone Glacier because I'm from there, but hopefully that other people could project their own, images onto this monumental space, I guess.
Wow, that's exquisitely beautiful, not least what you do with the etymology of the Rhone River. We're transitioning here from ghost intimacies and fugue states to your work with the speculative political funeral for the glacier. And we'll do that by showing a clip from the last part of Belly of a Glacier. And while we cue that up, I just want to say that we see both in the film and in the installation, as part of the assemblage, a sculptural work that's also in the gallery. Even the Stones Are Alive, a letter to the future, which features a bronze plaque on a fiberglass support that resembles a large stone that reads, "This is the first glacier to lose its status as a glacier in this region. Within the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to have melted. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what's happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. September 2050. And with that, let's go ahead and watch. So, Ohan, orchestrating a speculative political funeral to the more immediate loss of the Rhone Glacier that stands in for glaciers in the plural, for climate catastrophe, and for a dying planet more generally. The political funeral, this speculative form, becomes a call to action as a kind of not letting go. Would you speak to how you understand and work with what I've been calling, and maybe this works for you, melancholy as medium, a refusal to mourn and move on, that sort of normative mourning, and instead carries our losses with us and works with grief as a maligned source of power.
Yes, I love now, Jill, that there's a term for what I think I've been trying to do for a while now, and I didn't know how to put words to it. So thank you so much for doing the work that you do. I deeply appreciate it because death is for the living, ultimately. And I'm also thankful that you read what it says on this plaque because it's probably hard for people to see. I would like to acknowledge that this plaque also is in a way mimicking another plaque that existed from the first glacier funeral that happened in Iceland in 2019 for the Okjökull or Oke Glacier. And so I'm using a very similar format. It was also a letter written to the future on a bronze plaque, but then they attach it to, actual big rock that remains in the space where the glacier used to be. In this case, it's a fake fiberglass rock. But I like thinking through this as an object that exists inside of the speculative funeral that's taking place in 2050 and then now, is standing in this gallery next to where the film is being screened as a separate sculptural object, as in a way like elegy or this, the last words that are written onto metal or literally like into a rock. And I don't know, there's a few things that came up for me where I was thinking, like, what does it mean to create a funeral for something that is still alive? Um, and I think there's something really important where I'm asking the audience, yeah, what does it mean to mourn something before it's perished? Are we able to mourn something or somebody before they leave this world as we know it? How do we prepare for the imminent loss that we will all experience? Does mourning help us feel the urgency of this loss as a problem of anthropomorphic climate destruction? Can acts of mourning mobilize us to protect the most vulnerable, those who will be most affected by global warming and sea levels rising, namely the poor, POC, and global South communities? Um, and I think this question of collapsing deep time or geologic time with human time felt really important for me when creating a speculative funeral where none of us are supposed to be experiencing a collapse of these two different times. This has never happened. And so I think it's outside of our imagination to know how to cope with such a thing. And since funerals become the last, act of ritual, um, I thought, why not, create that as something that exists in my film that's on loop, that it could be that when you walk into the black box theater, the film begins with a funeral. It doesn't need to necessarily be the end of this film. It also could be the beginning or the middle point. And I think there's something about what happens after these funerals that I'm interested in. So it almost feels like where this project ended could also now be a starting point to where my work continues to go, and the conversations, I'm currently having, or also a lot of aspects that I really believe in the radical space of the classroom that Bell Hooks often refers to, where I think we shouldn't be scared to talk about death or the ongoing genocide or the current climate emergency and the effects for those of us in the future. So I think in a way it was like thinking through theater and staging and also a space for play to handle mourning or handle something that is ultimately always going to maybe be out of our control. I don't know if that really answers your question, Jill, but that's what I'll say for now.
Well, I mean, I think that sense of the funeral as a place of beginning, and also what does it do to acknowledge that we're in a state of mourning in advance, and how do you hold space for that work feels really important, and a perfect way to transition to your solo exhibition at AIR Gallery, Beside the Sun. And Min, could we move to those? So toward the end of the slideshow, the show's assemblage features a large photographic installation notation for a wounded land that we see here in the back, selection from the Killed Negative archive of 100 hole-punched black and white archival images commissioned in 1935 by the Farm Security Administration to document the struggles of farm life in the wake of the Great Depression. The images are made from killed negatives deemed extraneous to the project and never meant to see the light of day. The wall of photographs are set next to a large photograph on an adjacent wall called Leakage One that serves up 5 pig bladders filled with water. And on the floor are 2 large sculptures. We see one in the foreground here, lovers, earth auger bits, and then a slight bit on the so here's a different perspective on lovers, earth auger bits, and the photograph Leakage One. And on the opposite wall is enclosure. Both render extractive and enclosing tools, the drill bit and the fence, in the fragrant, pliable softness of beeswax. In printing these images with their floating black holes, Ohan, you write that the holes of the killed negative are now misplaced suns within a space of dreams. And you speak of the sculptures as loving eulogies in object form of a disappearing landscape. Would you speak here to the transformative aesthetic and even political work of elegy and eulogy, the loving form of lament that works directly with the tools of extraction, that relates the camera and the photographic archive to drilling and enclosing, but not to repeat the violence and violation, but rather alter our relation to what's consigned to death, including killed negatives and the settler farm landscapes to which they're related?
Sure. Yeah. I thought I have something written down here just in case people are not familiar with this archival photographic body of work. So just to give those of you a little more information on this installation, I use photographs depicting the landscape as well as farm animals from a US government photography project that was headed for most of its existence by Roy Stryker, formerly an economics instructor at Columbia University, and employed such photographers as Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Russell Lee, Arthur Rothstein, etc., Gordon Parks. And the project initially documented cash loans made to individual farmers by the Resettlement Administration and the construction of planned suburban communities. And the second stage focused on the lives of sharecroppers in the South and migratory agricultural workers in the Midwestern and Western states. As the scope of the project expanded, the photographers turned to recording both rural and urban conditions throughout the United States, as well as mobilization efforts for World War II, right? So I'm also thinking like how history repeats itself, like what was happening 100 years ago versus what's happening now feels really important to me. And then there was one other part, Jill, that I actually was reading from your necro landscaping, and if it's okay, I would like to just quote you here. You say, but in pressing off from McBrien's exclusive emphasis on capitalism and the ostensibly dead matter of fossil fuels, I'm interested in how Necrocene works to further shift the emphasis from death as extinction, death as abstract state, death as the opposite of life, to death as felt, material presence, and active process by giving us death as a scene in which we are vulnerably situated. Poaching and redeploying Necroscene promises not just a foreground, but also to make palpable the presence of death in life, that is, of the ostensibly verdant life world of landscape as scene of death, in which we are positioned not as remote witnesses or only as mourners, but also as the mortal, vulnerable, exposed among the killable and the dead. And to me, this I thought linked really well to thinking about the killed negatives. So these negatives are hole punched, where one editor comes in and decides what's a bad photograph, what was not composed right, was the lighting off, what is blurry, and through that is punching a hole into an artwork, basically, or someone's vision, and that which is then considered a form of destruction or inherent violence for me becomes a space of, yeah, maybe a space for dreaming or a space of thinking about the surreal, or in this case, a space for notations. And I would like to reference Tina M. Campt, who's really influential to my work, and her brilliant book, Listening to Images. She thinks about photography's relationship to sound and to frequency. And there is something about the way that I installed this work alongside the amazing help of Joseph Messer. That I really was thinking through how do works function rhythmically, or how can through a force of destruction or the violent act of first photography in itself, but then also the editing of it in such a way of punching a hole become a notation for a landscape that does no longer exist in this way, or also the landscape for, a photographer or artist like myself who definitely would not be receiving funding because of my gender identity or my interests in taking care of the landscape today, and how we are living in this sense of wounded land, but I guess that there's still poetry, and I hear sound or music when I'm in this space, and the drill as an object started in belly of a glacier, where at one point you're in the deepest hole that was ever drilled in the ice sheet, and you're being kind of sucked out by this limp dick flashlight. And I started thinking about the drill as a very, phallic object, something that is for like penetrating the surface of the earth, that is, links earth sciences to photography. And then I was like, okay, well, maybe I should create this shape, but using beeswax. I was like, beeswax to me feels like a material that reminds me of church or my childhood home, or a connection to something that at times felt really warm and tender, and not the church part, the part at home. And also thinking about this homoerotic relationship. Of course, The Lovers is referencing Felix Gonzalez Torres and his partner Ross, and the time that they did not have due to the death of AIDS, or the death AIDS inflicted deaths, and maybe also thinking about how I don't have this sense of ancestral archive because of these untimely deaths. And so definitely referencing an artist who I owe so much to and look up to in so many ways. And yeah, thinking about how, again, I can try and think about care in relation to photography, or queering the drill into an object of queer desire, or love rather than exploitation, or yeah, taking out something from the earth. And I know, Julie, you showed my Belly of a Glacier book, and in the middle of that book, actually, one of my favorite parts is Colleen Smith's Volcano Manifesto that she so generously allowed me to reprint. And she has a quote in there, exactly, yeah, thank you, where she says, quote, "I respectfully suggest that the geologist who is liberated from the praxis of extraction becomes a poet." And I think this is just such a powerful sentence that Colleen writes. And it's something that I'm trying to do. I'm like, use a very violent tool, and I've studied photography, I teach photography. How am I able to use something in a way that perhaps is making me closer to poetry than a form of extraction?
That's gorgeous, Ohan. And I selfishly want to ask you one last question before we move to Q&A, which is to build out a little bit more from what you've already started to elaborate in perhaps starting from the obvious naming of the beeswax drill bits laid side by side here and called lovers. I wonder if we could speak to the ways that your trans-feminist ecological care work as an artist may work with and through forms of mourning, the elegy, the eulogy, the memento mori, the still life, or natur mort, which directly translated would be dead nature, and the speculative funeral, but also with what we might call really a praxis of joy, a kind of joyful erotics and poetics that also insists on infusing the meanwhile with the livingness. Svetlana Kito, in her essay For Beside the Sun, writes that for you, reckoning with death is a political act that opens up boundless possibilities. And I'm wondering if that opening has to do with a particular way in which you practice what we might call a kind of care for death that's pulsing, erotic, threaded with and activating a desire.
Yeah. Back to what I was saying before, I think maybe thinking about the inspiration from histories of ACT UP and die-ins and political funerals that were staged as public acts of grief and rage also are really important to me because like I said, I don't have so much imagery that I can look towards when it comes to mourning and with these die-in funerals there was something where it felt this beautiful combination of what um seems to be like ultimate sadness but also rage or protest and like combining both of these forces. And so I think with this work and the work I'm trying to move forward with is also just thinking about how the materiality, let's say, of like, when I see these archival photographs and the content is doing so much for me, but also thinking about the materiality of them, like the space of the archive, my body's relationship to archive, my body's relationship to photographs. So, for example, even with this, which also for the gallery that it's in feels quite monumental in size installation. The two photographs that are like factories with smoke coming up, those are actually images from a company where they were making coffins. And so really also thinking about the images that I'm picking are in relation to death functioning in their own ways. Or there's an image that has there's three crosses, but the one that's kind of centered with the white cross, it's a bed, it's an interior space of a bed, and above this bed, in German you would say Ehebett. I don't know if that word exists. It's like where a husband and wife would be sleeping. It's a bed that's too big for one person, I guess. And above the bed, there's a painting of what appear to be the husband and wife. But then because Snyder crossed that out, there's something about also thinking about um, the erasure or yeah, thinking about how can we create a new future for the queer community that's going against heteronormativity. And so I think in the way that the images that I picked, because there's so many of them, I'm really looking towards the subtlety and content, and then also, of course, thinking about as an artist, my relationship to the animals like pigs or sheep or cows, like hoofed animals that we rely on as filmmakers and analog photographers to create the gelatin for, let's say, gelatin silver prints or analog film. So thinking really about uh, cross lineage between species and between then also different generations of people who are no longer here. And for the still life with the pig's bladders, I'm really inspired by the carrier bag theory of fiction written by Ursula K. Le Guin, where she argues that the carrier bag came before the spear or the weapon, to hunt with. And so there's something about the holes that are punched that feel like, you could imagine that being a spear, or then of course with the drills, thinking that in relationship to a spear, and the carrier bags being these objects that I find the pig splatters erotic in the photograph. When I look at the photograph, it's almost like I get aroused, but I also know that these were organs, piss-filled bladders. Um, and so there's something about this relationship between Sex and Death, or Eros and Thanatos, that I think is of deep interest to me. And these pig splatters historically also being used as carrier bags for oil painters back in the day, where oil paint was stored. They were used to create American football, so it has this Americana context and reference to sports and athleticism, which I'm also really into in relation to erotics even, and then also as musical instruments. And so this relationship to music and sound that then references this notation for a wounded land again. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that, pulling out so much of the really exquisite detail. And with that, I have to stop being selfish and let us move to general Q&A. Min, do you have some questions for us?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jill and Ohan. That was so fascinating. We have some questions from the audience. The first question is from anonymous member in the audience. Whose voice speaks of the melting snowflake at the beginning of your film?
Yeah, so that's one of my childhood memories, but the voice is spoken by Juna Ruesterholz, which is my best friend Miri Ruesterholz's daughter. And so for me, it was really important to begin the film with a young girl or early teenager's voice, as a stand-in for she's the alter ego version of myself, but it's, yeah, my best friend's daughter, who also is speaking in the Swiss German dialect that's indigenous to the Rhone Glacier, which is important to note as well. And then the voice that comes in during the second clip that you hear is then my voice. So it's almost, you then skip time, and then it's my voice as me now, Ohan, but also speaking in that same dialect.
Thank you. The next question is also from an anonymous member in the audience. How should I understand the colors in the ice slides? Are the colors enhanced through your techniques at all? And we also saw in the later clip that you've also used this like red sort of overtone. And we were also curious whether or what informs your decision to incorporate color, and what are some of the considerations and found your decision to add color in certain areas and not?
Yeah, yeah, these are two great questions. So the first for the ice slides, it's basically like 1.5 millimeter of thinly cut ice from 3 different cores that you're looking at. And then the ice curator is putting a petrographic lens on top of um, the glass that's right above this thinly cut ice. And through his shifting of the petrographic lens, we're able to see the structure, just the organic structure that naturally occurs in these ice cores. And I didn't enhance anything. That's just naturally the way it looks through the petrographic lens. It's like a science trick, I guess. But the reason that there's different shapes and colors is based on the location from where they've been cored and how deep that slither came from. And so I maybe should have mentioned this before, but through the sound component. So the first image you see, to me, almost looks like a camouflage, like navy camouflage. That's the blue color, and the sound component for that is all sounds recorded in the Swiss Alps. So we have yodeling, or we have this milk bowl, which is like a ceramic bowl with a 5 franc coin that's going in circular motion, the local church bells, family members' laughter. And then when we get to the second slide, which is really like beautiful neon colors, all those sounds are from places in the global south. So we have the Amazons falling, we have whales screaming, different like insects. Um, and in the last one, which is from a very different region, again, we have sounds that are from local protests from New York to factory sounds, airplanes, and like collapse of like industrial collapsing sounds, I would say. Um, so I hope that answered your question about the ice slides. It's really just scientifically where they're from and how deep. And they really connect to abstract painting for me, or I really think about like the relationship to abstraction and um, in those, which feels really important to me. And then for the red coloring, there's throughout the film different archival footage that I use. And it starts with footage from the Rhone Glacier and then slowly goes down all the way with the last shot being of the Mediterranean Sea. And I pictured the Rhone Glacier as if it were a person sitting or standing upright, the glacier being the head and the feet being the Mediterranean Sea, and the glacier having a fever. So, in the first scene, when the photograph starts to turn red, I'm trying to say that it's like my body's implication, that my body heat is melting the snowflake, but also thinking of old archival film where if red is the color that lasts the longest, so other dyes have faded out. So it speaks to aging or this form of nostalgia in relationship to the medium, and then ultimately to the glacier having a fever and melting. And so that's why those clips are red.
Thank you. The third question is from GE. How did you arrive at this powerful practice of personification from literature, art, music? Thank you.
Hmm. Um, I mean, I think just spending so much time as a child there, and a lot of my work starting from a very personal place, and then definitely writers like someone like Max Frisch or even Johann Wolfgang von Goethe have been writers that were really influential to me when I was a teenager growing up. I'm I play instruments and love music and love listening, and listening is a big part of my practice. So I definitely would say music is a part, and thinking of the musics that have shifted and shaped my way of thinking. And and then just also studying and teaching certain aspects around like hyper objects and the Anthropocene, and thinking about environmentalism in relation to other things that are happening in the world. Yeah. Gee, I hope that answered your question.
I have two questions to close us out. I wanted to hear you started to talk about the animals towards the end of your conversation, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about sort of non-human organisms that you like to incorporate into your artwork. And my second question to you, the two exhibition, while I was looking at the slides, have quite different medium and the look and look to it, but then you have this sort of shared there are like shared thematics that kind of appear in both places or both exhibitions. And I was wondering, assuming that you were kind of preparing for the two exhibitions simultaneously, whether preparing for this exhibition and installing the works have also been a place of exploration for you, the sense of intimacy or tactility or materiality that's kind of central to, or that I'm picking up from your work. I was wondering if those were, um, how those manifested into questions that you were exploring while you were installing the two shows.
Yeah, thank you, Min, for those questions. I love animals so much. And so, I started this Queer Still Life series in 2015, and I'm collaborating with my cat Sappho in that series. I'm collaborating with the octopus. I'm, collaborating with butter and thinking about how butter is made and butter in relationship to my upbringing and cows. And I think, kind of how Jill said in the beginning, how we use the terminology calving to describe a glacier tongue or glacier snout, glacier slit, belly of a glacier. I really was interested in how we use certain language that's in relation to animals to describe natural landscapes. And so I think knowing that I knew I wanted to film a cow birth. That was the first thing I knew. Even before I knew what the project was, I was like, there's going to be a cow birth. And then from there, it's like everything kind of unraveled to the end of, on a linear sense, the end being the speculative funeral where at first, I thought I would invite all my queer and trans friends to perform and be in it. Dorian Wood, whose song we would listen to, I was like, this will be someone speaking. Dean Spade, one of my best friends, is going to be giving this amazing speech, who also cares deeply about environmental issues in relationship to trans rights. Um, and then I realized I think I don't want people. I think I want to remove, and obviously it's not removed because I'm there and everyone who's collaborating in this film are there. My editor Katrin Eberson is there, and Richie Carey, the sound designer, is there. And there's something about showing the cow as the last living creature witnessing something that happened that felt really important to me. It made me think of, the landscape that's dotted by cows and then returning to this place of almost like absurdity, like how with environmental work, I think that so often I see work that's created with is about doom or data, and I was trying to stay away from that, where I thought if I don't show humans at a funeral, but I show their gloves that are left over, or their Kleenex that's there, or certain aspects, the lipstick on a plastic cup, it's speaking more to the waste or the capitalism that we're leaving behind as humans. And then this cow that's almost like pathetic in the end. It's like the cow relies on us as we do on the cow is like this last creature watching. And when I first started making this work, a scientist told me that the way we can understand the belly, like that which is underneath the glacier, which we can never actually photograph or film, because if we could, there would be no belly and the glacier would have disappeared. We can only compare it to a cow's stomach. So there's something about the relationship between the cow and how it digests food, and it's constantly moving through actually three stomachs that scientists use to compare to how a healthy glacier body is in constant flux and is like moving in and out. And so, yeah, I think this cross species collaboration has been really important for me for a long time. With the beeswax, maybe the last thing I'll say is obviously thinking of bees and like the importance of bees in our ecosystem and environment as the last interspecies collaborators that I worked with. And yeah, the show at AIR, I really took it as a possibility to experiment with new forms. I don't make sculpture, and these beeswax sculptures were also made in collaboration with Sam Pasapane, who is an incredible sculptor herself, and also works at Williams College, and she generously helped me with these sculptures. So I'd also like to thank her in making them. And it was extremely difficult to create these sculptures. They kept breaking over and over again. There's something about failure and this impossibility of creating a gentle, soft, beautifully smelling, and I think very sexy object out of a drill. And so this aspect of failure was big. And I definitely see this as a starting point to the next works I'll be doing. I usually work in stages, so this now very much feels like, okay, this is the first stage, and now I'm gonna like slow down and like keep working on this and further develop the work. Yeah. Should I introduce Dorian Wood's song? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Um, So I'm really excited to be introducing Dorian Wood, who's an absolutely incredible singer and performance artist and composer and visual artist who I know from Los Angeles, my queer Los Angeles community, who has since moved to outside of Boston, and so she's on the East Coast now. Very talented, incredible human being, and maybe G, back to your question about if music has been inspiration, Dorian Wood's voice has been a major inspiration for me for a very long time. Um, and we collaborated on this song where I wrote the text and the lyrics. And and I said I could imagine him in these two tones, but do what you want. And then she created this elegy, and for my show in Los Angeles, for example, every 12 minutes the song would come on as like this constant reminder, like a punctuation at the end of something. And so it feels really beautiful to hear her voice and hear her sing and end this conversation. Yeah.
In memory of the Rhone, a landscape for fallen angels to cross. The Rhone, to flow, to flee. The melting water moves through veins and valleys, down to the Mediterranean Sea, remembering what it used to be. Once I lost you, I was faced with my own death. Nothing any longer separates me from it except time. The presence and the absence. La présence et absence. La presenza e l'assenza. La presencia y l'assenza. Die Anwesenheit und die Abwesenheit. Aludur walia. Prania de mungesa. Prisutnos diotsutnos. And it's hard to love. There's so much to hate. Hanging on to hope. We don't need another hero. We don't need to know the way home.
Thank you, Ohan and Jill. Thank you, Mo from Mass Mocha and Taylor from AI Art Gallery for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Rachel Stern and Dr. Ksenia M. Sobuiva on the occasion of Lover's Eye on View at A Hug from the Art World. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Ohan.
Thank you, Ohan. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Ohan. Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon. Absolutely.